Now, Robert, I'm bringing this up not to endorse the trope, just to highlight. There's an argument here where you say Putin's three objectives: no nukes, no NATO, no Nazis. And when you reference Ukraine building up however many troops, 60,000 troops in the Donbass region, their argument is going to be they're there to counter the Russian separatists. It's sort of like, coming down on the Quebec separatists. So you go to the area where the separatists exist, use Ukraine military to suppress insurrectionist, sovereigntist, pro-Russian militia in the Donbass region. That'll be the argument. The question to you is now, when you say that the Nazi problem in Ukraine is a real problem, people's reflexive response is Zelensky's Jewish. What real problems has any Nazi interest caused in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia? And the ADL came out and said, for whatever it's worth, people, the ADL came out, and the Anti-Defamation League, it's not worth very much. I don't have much. I don't hold them in high esteem, but they raised the argument. Yeah, there's Yahtzees in Ukraine, like there's Yahtzees in America, like there's Yahtzees in Russia. Except, oddly enough, when you see one Yahtzee flag at a protest in Ottawa, everyone's a Yahtzee. But when there's actual battalions in Ukraine, it's not an issue. But what real issue were any Yahtzee-like battalions actually causing in Ukraine, and more specifically for Russia, to justify that as the third branch of your tripartite question?
So there's two different aspects. As to the Donbass, the problem is the Ukraine signed the Minsk Accords in 2015, and that required they not have certain troops there, they not have certain weapons there, and they not do mass shelling. They did all three. And in fact, they violated the ceasefire, according to the Organization for Society and Cooperation in Europe, which was on location. They violated the ceasefire more than 2,000 times in just the weekend prior to with shelling. And you can just go through the Donbass region, and they bombed they bombed schools, they bombed churches, they bombed houses, they bombed buildings. Many stories coming out of there of random shootings of people, of, husbands and wives trying to escape, of kids dying, etc. All the horrors that are being attributed to the Russian invasion or the Russian attack has been taking place in Donbass for 8 years at a broader scale. But the biggest problem is the Minsk Accords and their agreement related there too, to respect the independence of that, all of which again stems from the Maidan coup of 2014. These groups were only concerned after they overthrew the democratically elected government with the backing of George Soros's NGOs and the United States money. Lindsey Graham and John McCain were on the ground, and you can find video of them not only meeting with some of these neo-Nazi aligned groups, but saying that they planned on launching an attack on Russia and to use it against Russia. So that's where it's relevant. They've explicitly said they are going to discriminate and try to basically ethnically cleanse as much of the Donbass region of Russians as possible. And that's the ongoing threat. In Putin's perspective, the only long-term objective of a nuclear-armed NATO with Nazi elements in its regime in Ukraine is to come after Russia. And so I disagree that Ukraine would ever actually invade Russia or NATO would actually invade Russia, but that was his conclusion. And again, if we were at a trial and it was totally neutral people, I wouldn't like my chances. I would say Putin would have the better argument, evidence-wise.
Someone just said, people saying that there's no justification for the invasion. Go check out history. When I think it was the 6-Day War in Israel, when Israel preemptively started a war, blew up the Egyptian airstrips, Air Force. They basically launched a war and invaded, I don't know how many, 4 of the neighboring countries in the absence of any actual invasion from those neighboring countries. Now my understanding is that there was much more immediate urgency, clear urgency for the 6-Day War than one could argue exists now for any preemptive invasion by Russia. But how do you retort to that? Like, okay, well, what was the urgent need to invade Ukraine, even if it's on the eastern provinces? What was the urgent need if this situation had been the way it had been for 6-8 years?
Yeah, that's where I am skeptical. I don't see the imminent risk for preemptive war, but I don't know what Russia knows. And like I said, from an evidentiary perspective, they would have all of these aggressive accelerating statements that Zelensky went to the Munich Security Council, said he wanted both NATO membership and nuclear weapons. And the weekend before, 60,000 Ukrainian troops were amassing along the Donbass to violate the Minsk Accords in all likelihood, based on their mass shelling and troop presence of certain weapons there. And they may have, and then they believe that, and believe they have evidence of biological weapons being developed in Ukraine with U.S. support. They have the statements of U.S. senators saying their goal is to go after Russia. Adam Schiff, head of the Intelligence Committee for the House, famously said during the Ukraine Gate impeachment that the goal is to use Ukraine to fight Russia there rather than we fight them. So they could amount a long litany of evidence. Major think tanks, the Rand Institute and others, that was developing arguments for how to use Ukraine to basically take out Russia or regime change in Russia. So that's why I say if it was a purely neutral jury, my position that there was no imminent risk would have weaker evidentiary support than Putin's argument that there was.
Guys, I'm only bringing up the Israel-Palestinian analogy because a lot of those wars, the theory could apply mutatis mutandis. My question to you, Robert, is my personal opinion, even the idea of a preemptive invasion is, from my understanding and what I've been able to surmise from the evidence, preemptive itself, or no, sorry, premature itself. But the better question is, why now and not why not 2 years ago and why not in 2 years from now?
While Trump was president, Trump had made clear he was skeptical of NATO, opposed Ukraine joining NATO, thought NATO was useless and the U.S. should probably opt out of it. When he tried to cut that deal early on, he was blocked by the Russiagate bogus scandal. And then when he tried to discipline or limit the amount of arms going to Ukraine and try to get Ukraine to actually clean up their government, he was impeached. So it's not a coincidence that the two greatest investigations and efforts to derail the Trump presidency relate to Ukraine and the kind of people involved. People should ask why they're on the side of George Soros, Hillary Clinton, and Mitt Romney, on the side of Klaus Schwab and the EU. If they're going to talk about Putin apologists, any of those people, you're on George Soros' side. You're on Hillary Clinton's side. You're on the side of the Clinton Foundation. You're on the side of the neocons and Mitt Romney. Like Jordan Peterson. God bless Jordan. But just like he couldn't get the pandemic right out of the gate, remember, shut up and take the vaccine, he also can't get, like, he puts one of the biggest warmongering neocons on to explain Ukraine. This is a guy that's neck deep in it. Victoria Nuland is on tape meeting with neo-Nazis to help the coup in 2014, now back involved in the administration. It was the Ukraine Gate key personnel who went and tried to impeach the president of the United States, Donald Trump. And the Kagan was gung-ho on the first both Iraq wars. And my view is I'm not going to take anybody seriously as an expert who thinks the Iraq war in 2003 was great, justified, and good policy. But that's who's being cited. So I think it reflects and represents that sort of broader ambiance and environment of who's there. To the credit of people like Mike Cernovich, Jack Posobiec, a range of other people, congressional candidate Joe Kent, J.D. Vance, they've been skeptical of what's going on because they see who's supporting it and backing it. But the reason why Putin Russia did not go in before, I believe, it's always speculative at this point, but is that Trump was skeptical of NATO and was trying to limit what Ukraine was doing. And every time he tried, he was either subject to a mass criminal investigation or an impeachment. So he wasn't able to achieve his objectives. But Russia didn't have any doubts. It wasn't because Trump was super strong. It was because Trump was smart. And that he's actually said this recently. He said, our leaders are dumb. Putin is smart. Our leaders are dumb. That he's not going to get into details about this. But that's, in fact, what I believe was the reason. As long as Trump was president, Russia did not believe Ukraine would ever be an imminent risk to them and believed they had a chance at achieving a peaceful resolution and disposition. Once, as the Russian ambassador told the United Nations, which might be a bridge to our next conversation, they believe, Putin and the Russians believe that the election was stolen from Trump in 2020 and said so at the United Nations. They saw that as an acceleration of the anti-Russia project that was going to present imminent risk to their safety and security and future. And the question is whether they were right. But if you're looking at it from their perspective, these people are so nuts, they're willing to launch a false criminal investigation, launch a false impeachment, and remove him when he got elected. In their view, would you trust the Biden administration not to be an imminent risk or threat,
Robert,
when they've made so much money off of the Ukraine grift?
I trust. Well, not just them. Others have made money off the billions in aid. Money corrupts.
Number one donor to the Clinton Foundation, Ukrainians.
Now, I just want to say, no justifying an invasion. I guess then D-Day.
I mean, there's the problem. Okay, then do you say that all of our invasions were wrong? Were we wrong legally, morally?
Someone will say that's a whataboutism. I'll say, in retrospect now,
it's called standards. It's what the rule of law is. We have to have one rule. We can't have one rule for us and another rule for somebody else. One rule. That's what the rule of law is all about. One rule.
I'm just going to say one thing. If all invasions are bad, D-Day was bad. The battle that turned World War II was bad because you were invading a foreign country.